Hello again. Let's continue on in Cooper and John chapter 11, and let's discuss a little bit more about what happens to different levels of employment and unemployment based on the minimum wage. And we're going to come back and look at this concept of elasticity, which we introduced last week. First of all, we're going to look at what happens to levels of employment and unemployment if the real minimum wage increases, but then we're going to look at the size of the change in employment when the real minimum wage increases, as well as the size of the change in unemployment. So let's go right into it. Remember, the demand side of the labor market are the employers, the firms who hire labor. The supply side of the labor market are individuals, the workers, who are willing to supply labor in the market. So remember, what happens when we increase the minimum wage, let's say from $5 to $6? What we're going to see is we find a decrease in the amount of hours that employers want to employ from, in our instance, this is going back to what we started in part 1 of chapter 11. It went from 32,000 hours down to 24,000 hours. Thus, when the minimum wage increases, employment level decreases. That's on the demand side of the market. Now, on the supply side of the market, thinking about those who wish to supply their labor in the market, when the minimum wage increases, you would think that workers would desire to work more. First of all, the workers who are currently employed might want to work some more hours because they make more per hour, but also new workers might desire to enter the market. But because new workers are now coming into the market and wishing to supply their labor, but employers are supplying less, we see an increase in the unemployment level right here. So, to summarize, when we raise the minimum wage from $5 an hour to $6 an hour, the overall employment level in the market will decrease and unemployment will increase. This was the original amount of unemployment. Now we have a bigger amount of unemployment. Previously, this was the amount of employment. Now we have a smaller amount of employment. Now, these are good pieces of information, but they are what we would call qualitative. I don't know how much employment will decrease or how much unemployment will increase. So then we want to look at how big are these effects. First, let's look at the effect on the demand for labor, meaning how much less work will employers or firms demand. The way to measure that is, once again, in terms of elasticity. This is going to be the wage elasticity of labor demand, or for short, we sometimes just call it the elasticity of demand for labor. The way we measure any elasticity is always the percentage change in quantity, in this case, the percentage change in the quantity of labor demanded, divided by the percentage change in price. And since we're talking the labor market, the percentage change in price will be the real wage. Remember, elasticity always measures a sensitivity. Now we've got to look to the whole phrase to figure out the sensitivity of what to what. And in this case, it's the sensitivity of labor demand, the amount of labor demanded, based on the wage rate. In this case, we are technically asking how much less labor will be demanded for every increase in the wage rate. If labor demand is relatively inelastic, we would say that the amount of labor that employers will decrease is a smaller amount. The decrease in demand will be smaller if the elasticity of the demand for labor is relatively inelastic. However, if the demand for labor is relatively elastic, the decrease in employers' demand will be much larger. Think about this like a rubber band. The more elastic a rubber band is, the more it stretches with the same amount of force. The less elastic a rubber band is, the less it changes with the same amount of force. In this case, the force is the change in wage rate. The same change in wage rate, aka the same force, will cause a smaller change in labor demand if demand is inelastic. It will create a larger change in labor demand if labor demand is relatively elastic. Let's look at this graphically. What we see here is a demand for labor curve based on the hourly real wage. If you notice, this is much more flat. This is a labor demand curve that's relatively elastic. It means for every change in price, notice this is the change in price right here, we have a greater change in the amount of labor demanded down here. Let's look at another option. This is a much steeper demand curve for labor, and that's because it is relatively inelastic. For every change in the minimum wage, we see a much smaller change in the quantity of labor demanded. So, if we're going to summarize, the more elastic labor demand is, the greater change in employment. The more inelastic labor demand is, the smaller change in employment. This can also be said with this nice little chart, which we pulled from your book. More elastic demand for labor gives us a large change in employment. More inelastic demand for labor gives us a smaller change. Again, think of your rubber band. Now let's look at what happens with the supply of labor, the amount of hours that individual workers in the market wish to supply of their labor. Once again, to analyze the size of an effect, we simply need to measure elasticity. Elasticity measures how big the effects of things are. And once again, elasticity is always a percent change in quantity divided by a percent change in price. In the labor supply market, the percent change is in labor supply. That's the quantity. And on the denominator, the percent change in price is called the real wage in the labor market. The wage elasticity of labor supply measures the sensitivity of the supply of labor by workers due to changes in the wage rate. So essentially, we are asking, how much more labor do workers desire to supply for every increase in the wage rate? Remember, you're going to have a positive elasticity for the supply of labor because when wage rates go up, the desire to supply labor goes up, whereas what we just looked at in the demand for labor, we have a negative elasticity because for every dollar that the wage rate goes up, employers demand less labor. Now, going back to our supply of labor. The supply of labor is relatively inelastic if workers increase in their desire to work, but it's a smaller increase with a change in wage rate, whereas a relatively elastic labor supply would see a much larger desire of workers to work if the wage rate increases. So again, thinking of my rubber band, the force is the change in wage rate. If I have a relatively inelastic rubber band, then for every dollar change in the wage rate, I don't see as much change in the desire of workers to supply their labor. Whereas if my rubber band is relatively elastic, I see a much bigger change in the desire of workers to supply their labor in the market for every raise in the minimum wage. Let's look at that graphically. Notice here I have one market, but two ways of looking at it. I have a labor supply curve that is relatively flat, which means it's relatively elastic. Every time the wage rate increases, I see actually a bigger increase in the desire to supply labor. Whereas my relatively inelastic labor supply curve, notice it's much steeper. For every change in the wage rate, I see a much tinier change in the desire to supply labor. Inelastic causes smaller changes. Elastic causes bigger changes. Let's look at it right here. The more inelastic my supply, the more elastic my supply, the greater change in the desire to work. Thus, because there are more workers who desire to work, I will actually see greater unemployment in the market. If my labor supply is more inelastic, I see a smaller change in their desire to work, which means overall, I'll see less unemployment. The effects of unemployment in the market, the size of the effects of unemployment, are based both on the elasticity of supply as well as the elasticity of demand. If I have very elastic supply and elastic demand, I expect a large change, a very large change in unemployment. If I have inelastic supply and inelastic demand, I expect to see a much smaller change in unemployment. The effects of unemployment are determined both by the supply elasticity and the demand elasticity of labor. Now, who is affected by the minimum wage? Well, just to quickly summarize so you have a sense of what on earth is going on in a government that decides to deal with a minimum wage, first of all, they tend to care mostly about low-skilled workers. Those low-skilled workers who are employed are the group most likely to be paid the minimum wage. We call these sometimes the working poor, because they're working, but they aren't usually making nearly as much money. We also have another group of low-skilled workers, and they would be unemployed. So they're seeking work, but they're unable to find it. Lastly, we have another group of people, which is pretty much everyone else in the economy, and we call them the relatively rich. They are the higher skilled workers who have jobs that pay more than the minimum wage. So let's see some of the relative effects on these three groups of people. The low-skilled workers who keep their jobs, or those who manage to receive new jobs, are better off with a minimum wage because they make more per hour now. The working poor, thus, are better off. The low-skilled workers who lose their jobs are now worse off with a minimum wage. Not only did they lose their jobs, but for those that are remaining unemployed or started out unemployed, they often are worse off. Now, there could be no effect on them, but they are often worse off because it's now harder to find a job because there are fewer jobs available. Lastly, we have the relatively rich. They are generally considered worse off because they are usually the firm owners. They're people who own stock in these firms. And because the firms will overall be making lower profits because of their higher marginal costs, we usually think that the stocks will have a lower price, and so the relatively rich will be worse off. So in general, we say that the only people who are better off are the working poor. And the people who might potentially be worse off are going to be low-skilled workers who lost their jobs, the relatively rich who are facing higher stock prices, and potentially unemployed workers who are finding it more difficult to find a job. Overall, on the economy, what economists generally think are that the minimum wage may redistribute income from the relatively rich to the working poor. In other words, the relatively rich see lower stock prices for the firms that they own, but that money is going into the higher minimum wage that the working poor are receiving. But we will now see a deadweight loss. Your book calls this the equity efficiency trade-off. Essentially, we're just saying a policy was designed to more equitably redistribute income, and it caused an inefficiency or a deadweight loss in the market. The other big effect we see in the economy is that the only way really to measure which groups are better off and which groups are worse off and how much they're better off and how much they're worse off is always going to be dependent on the elasticity of labor supply and labor demand. That concludes this presentation for Chapter 11. The rest of the PowerPoint that you have on your Moodle page will go over some of the key terms as well as some of the key concepts or takeaways in the chapter.